So for this third exam, we're covering chapters 10 through 14, going from perfect competition through to monopoly. This is called market structures. And again, it's a broad sweep, moving again from perfect competition or pure competition. I think the author refers to it. So at any rate, going from pure competition or perfect competition to monopolistic competition, or it's also called imperfect competition. And then it's on to oligopoly, and finally on to monopoly, and a couple of different types of monopoly. A pure monopoly or a natural monopoly, if you will. At any rate, starting with perfect competition, the hallmarks, if you will, of perfect competition, it's easily identifiable. Perfect competition, there are a large number of participants, both in terms of the firms, the producers, and also the buyers, the consumers. The products themselves are identical, are very, very close. They're clones of one another. They're homogeneous. They're the same, basically. The next indicator of perfect competition would be the ease of entry or the exit. So it's relatively easy to enter the market, and it's also relatively easy to exit the market. So typically we think of something like farming for perfect competition. It's probably the closest thing that we have, agricultural products. And so it's not saying that it's cheap to buy a farm, but you can buy a farm. You go out there and buy a farm, and you can start farming in essence, right? And it's relatively simple to sell the farm. You simply sell the farm, and that's it. You're done. As opposed to some of the other market segments, that we're talking about in terms of market structure, it's not quite as easy. Again, it's not necessarily inexpensive, but it's relatively easy to enter into and or to exit when we're talking about perfect competition. Perfect competitors or competitors in perfectly competitive markets are price takers as opposed to price makers. The market price is the price that they get for their products, and that's it. There's no negotiation, no bargaining. That's the price, whatever that market price is for that given day, for that product, or whatever the terms are that are out there. Whatever the market price is, that is what your products will fetch. That's it. You won't be getting a penny more, or you won't be getting a penny more for your products. The consumer surplus is maximized, and there's no producer surplus, meaning then that, of course, the consumer surplus, we're saying that the consumers are getting their biggest bang for their buck. The no producer surplus means that the productive resources that are involved, the labor, entrepreneurship, capital, land, are not receiving any more than their opportunity cost level of compensation. And so bear in mind that that would also include normal profits. So there are no excess profits. That's what the no producer surplus really, really means when it comes right down to it. So in that perfectly competitive market, it's marked by, if you will, efficiency and equity. Both conditions are met. Efficiency is where price is equal to marginal cost. So that's the price equals MC, where it crosses that marginal cross point, and average cost is at a minimum. So it again, when marginal cost crosses up through average cost, it would be at that point where it is a minimum. So all three of these things kind of come together, if you will. That price, the price line, the demand curve, however you want to phrase it, the average revenue price, again, marginal cost and average cost meet at that one point. And also, so that would be the efficiency side. Maximum number of goods and services produced at the lowest possible price, right? Equity is where average cost is equal to average revenue. So again, all cost in this case, we're saying they're under the cost curve, under that average cost curve. And that represents, when we talk about cost, that also means some normal profit. So everything would be included at that point. Remember now, that's the lowest point of the average cost curve. So in a microeconomic sense, we have both equity and efficiency. So we meet both of those criteria. The equity side, again, where average cost is equal to average revenue. And the efficiency part where the price is equal to the marginal cost and the average cost itself is at a minimum. So that's the micro. And when we're talking about in a macro sense, that's where we have, again, that perfect competition keeps inflation down. It keeps you're unable to raise prices, if you will. It makes it much more difficult when you have perfect competition, when you're in perfectly competitive markets. So there are some benefits in the macro sense as well, not just the micro sense. Higher employment, there tends to be, you're using all of your productive resources to the maximum of their capability. That's the production possibility curve, right? And as a result of all this, there's reduced incidence and the severity of recessions. And that is, again, brought on by competition. So that heavy competition keeps us out of recessions for very long because your prices are adjusted accordingly. So again, that's what and the driver behind this, of course, is that in perfectly competitive markets, the competitors themselves are price takers, not price makers. So go over the chart again, if you will. What you'll notice is on the left chart that we're looking at, it looks like a typical supply-demand curve. Supply is sloping upward to the right, and the demand sloping downward to the right. To the right of that is the actual firm. So this is the market on the left and the firm is on the right. And what do we notice about this? We notice that the demand curve, or the average revenue curve, is horizontal. It's flat. And the other components that we've talked about already. So this is, remember now, when we talk about marginal revenue is 1/2 of the demand curve, the distance between the demand curve and the y-axis. And so in this case, of course, since it's horizontal, they share the same space. So average revenue, or the demand curve, is the same as the marginal revenue curve. They share the same exact spot, and that's also the demand curve. And then we walk through the various conditions so far as equity and efficiency are concerned. This is where it lives. This is where the consumer is the king, right? This is where consumer sovereignty reigns. This is where we as consumers would prefer all of our markets to be operating within this space, perfect competition. On the other hand, we as owners of those productive resources, not so much, right? Because we're only getting what? Our opportunity cost level of compensation. Again, that's where the equity lives. Is this the ideal for society? Yes, absolutely. The benefits from this accrue to both the household as consumer, of course, but it also, in terms of the household as producer, as owners of the productive resources, this guarantees that you're receiving what? Your opportunity cost level of compensation. So always kind of bear that in mind. This is the ideal market place out there. This is the ideal market structure, if you will. Maybe it doesn't seem like it for the producer, but when it comes right down to it, the beauty of perfect competition is that markets tend to clear more quickly, keeping us out of recessions and so on and so forth from a macro side as well. So always kind of keep these things in mind. So the idea here is that we're talking about moving away from perfect competition, but nonetheless, the images that we're looking at is actually flattening demand curve, where the demand curve is actually moves flatter, moves closer to what? Closer to that perfectly competitive demand curve that's horizontal to the parallel, if you will, to the x-axis. And the idea is that when we have a flatter demand curve, that prevents producers from raising prices, or they're less revenue enhancing, if you will. So the idea is that the flatter the demand curve, the more difficult it is for producers to raise prices. That is why it also has a tendency toward dampening the inflationary effects that are out there, if you will. So this is a pretty simple representation, and it holds for all market segments, if you will. Market structures, I should say, all components, all segments of those market structures, moving from perfect competition to monopoly, of course. The idea again is that average total cost being less than average revenue. So in the long run, so long as that is the case, you remain open. If, however, the average total cost is greater than that average revenue, meaning your costs are greater than your overall revenue, then what, of course, you would have no other choice than to shut down. So that's kind of what this depicts, this representation that we have here. So always keep in mind that we talk about profit maximization. Profit maximization occurs where marginal cost, remember marginal cost is 1/2 of that average revenue. So, marginal revenue rather is 1/2 of that average revenue. And so that marginal revenue, where it cuts that marginal cost, that is where profit maximization occurs. So again, I'll reiterate because I think I may have screwed that up a bit. So you take average revenue, and 1/2 of that average revenue is a marginal revenue. Remember, marginal is adding one more unit, so this is the additional unit, if you will. That's what that marginal revenue represents. Where it cuts through that marginal cost, that is where profit maximization occurs. When we talk about profit maximization, it comes in two forms. One is the profit maximization in terms of price, so profit maximizing price, and then there's the profit maximization in terms of quantity demanded. So again, starting from that point where marginal cost crosses marginal revenue, or vice versa, marginal cost crosses marginal revenue, going down to the demand curve, that gives us our profit maximizing quantity. And then if you go up to the demand curve, up to that average revenue curve, and then over to the price line, the y-axis, that is where profit maximizing price would be at, okay? So moving from perfect competition to imperfect competition or monopolistic competition, we generally speaking, we usually refer to this as monopolistic competition. Phrases that were coined by two economists, they were both British, I believe. Edward Chamberlain came up with imperfect competition, and Joan Robinson came up with monopolistic competition. It's also called a tangency solution, at least in reference to monopolistic competition. Occurred about the same time, would have been, I believe, in the 1930s. Again, they're both British. The takeaway was that we're looking at markets that are less than perfectly competitive. That's kind of the basis for which we're starting from. So when we talk about, we'll just stick with the term monopolistic competition or the tangency solution. Based on that monopolistic competition, we're looking at, again, a downward sloping demand curve. And what we also want to talk about is we'll look at that profit maximizing price again, profit maximization point where marginal cost is equal to marginal revenue, going up to the average revenue curve or the demand curve, and then over to the y-axis, the vertical axis, the price axis. That gets us our profit maximizing price. And what you'll notice is that it's at that point, this is where the tangency piece comes into play, where average cost is equal to average revenue. Okay, and so what do we know about average cost equaling average revenue? That is where where equity is at. So what we have with monopolistic competition, imperfect competition, but monopolistic competition, we'll stick with that again. We have the equity condition met, but what we find is that the average costs are not at the lowest point; they're above their lowest point. So we are violating efficiency. So we are in agreement with that equity proposition where average cost is equal to average revenue, that point at which we're producing, but it's higher than where it ought to be. So again, we are violating that efficiency. All right, so this is monopolistic competition. And we'll get into it more, but just in essence, when we talk about monopolistic competition, that would be in that the space of fast food restaurants, where they're basically the same thing, meaning that we're very close to perfect competition. It may not look like it from our pictures here, but in essence, they're very, very close, meaning that a fast food restaurant, for example, whether we're talking about McDonald's, Burger King, take your pick. You can go all the way out to even to a Taco Bell type of scenario. They're all delivering very similar things, meaning a certain amount of food at a certain price, various price points, um, and you're paying relatively, and I'm cautionary about this because prices, of course, have gone up significantly at fast food establishments. Since of late, I'll leave it at that. Nonetheless, they're relatively competitive, if you will, and they're competitive with each other, meaning that they're differentiated from one another. Meaning, if you go to Wendy's, you have a square hamburger versus going to McDonald's or Burger King, you have a round hamburger, and Burger King has the fire grilled, like hamburgers versus McDonald's, the regular grilled type burger. There are some variations, but this is where monopolistic competition lies, where it's very heavy competition, and the reality is that in the short run, they are highly competitive, and they have some market power. They're still price takers overall, but they do have a little bit of price power, and they're able to differentiate, and they're able to advertise to differentiate. So when you see advertising, always keep in mind that wherever there's advertising in a given space, there is you're in markets that are probably less than perfectly competitive, because again, in perfectly competitive markets, there's no need to advertise. There's no payback for advertising. So again, reiterating, we were walking through this competitive markets, this perfectly competitive markets, long-term equilibrium, our image that we have on the right, where we have equity is where average cost is equal to average revenue, and the efficiency piece again is where that average cost is at a minimum, and where the price is equal to that marginal cost. And this is again for monopolistically competitive firms. When we talk about the difference between monopolistically competitive firms and perfectly competitive firms, there is some product differentiation. They're pretty close to being the same, but there's a slight difference, and that's that product differentiation. We're paying a bit more for that. So in the short run, again, we're focusing on where marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost. So we're shooting for that profit maximization. Price is slightly above that average variable cost, and in the long run, we end up with zero profit. So what that means is that in the long run, it looks more like that perfectly competitive market, that flatter demand curve, right? When we say zero profit, we mean zero excess profit or zero economic profit. So we have, there is profit, but it's that competitive, that opportunity cost level profit where we're just getting enough to kind of stay in the game, right? So there's excess capacity in the long run. What that really means is that this is what drives us closer to that perfect competition. When that little bit of excess capacity, there's that extra slack in the market where firms they tend to exit. So this is why you see fast food restaurants opening and closing quite frequently. They may be there at the one corner for a long time, McDonald's, and then they may close up shop for whatever reason. And the next thing you know, the following month, there's another restaurant that goes in the same place, right? Whether we're talking about a McDonald's or a Burger King or whatever. Again, so basically again, that the difference between that perfect competition and the monopolistic competition, and that is that the monopolistic competition produces a bit less and charges a bit more. All right, and the perfect competition versus monopoly, the price is equal to that marginal revenue, and that demand curve, or the average revenue curve, is also equal to the marginal revenue, and the price is equal to marginal cost. All these things come together with perfect competition, and it's just not the case. It's something other than that as we move closer to monopoly, moving further and further away from that perfect competition space. Okay, so again, when I'm jumping from perfect competition to monopoly, but again, there we're talking about moving from perfect competition to monopolistic competition to oligopoly to monopoly. So anything other than perfect competition, we'll say, in this case, we're talking about monopoly, price is greater than marginal revenue. So the price is higher than the marginal revenue, meaning that we have a downward sloping demand curve or average revenue curve. The demand or average revenue is greater again than that average revenue curve, or excuse me, the average revenue curve is greater than the marginal revenue curve, again, because we're that downward sloping demand curve, right? And price is also higher than marginal cost. Again, this is reflected in that in the same relationship where we have, again, the downward sloping demand curve. And typical, this is, we show it in various forms, steeper, flatter, so on and so forth, but it's anything other than a flat demand curve. So there's a downward sloping demand curve or average revenue curve. And again, finally, we have, again, price is greater than that marginal cost. This is where you cut through where marginal cost equal to marginal revenue, profit maximization point, right? You have to go up to get to that average revenue curve and then over to the price. The price is going to obviously be significantly higher than that marginal cost. So theoretically, when we talk about monopoly, monopolies are illegal, all right? So monopoly, when I say that, is that this is why we have, when we hear the word trust and monopoly are synonymous. They are the same thing. So if we go back to the late 19th century in the United States, when we talk about trust busting, think of Theodore Roosevelt, President Roosevelt, and others at the time as well. There was a big push to get rid of trust or monopolies. You think of like Standard Oil, Carnegie with U.S. Steel, Vanderbilt with the railroads, and at Rockefeller again with oil. Those types of scenarios where they were monopolies, they were trust, they were extremely wealthy. Not unlike today. Think about it, like in terms of whether we're talking about an Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos or the owners of Google, etc., Microsoft with Bill Gates. There are some very, very wealthy people out there that are associated with firms that are, if they are not monopolies, they're not, because they're not the only ones in the space. They certainly behave very much like monopolies. Anyway, so is there a reason for a monopoly? The short answer is yes, there is. And we call them utilities. These are public utilities. These are natural monopolies. And when we talk about public utilities, natural monopolies, our rationale for them is that because of the economic circumstances, situation, the natural monopoly is really the only choice. And this is our real short little representation of that, looking at this chart. So what we have on the columns, remember columns are up and down. We have market type, and the next one down would be the units demanded by the market, the firms in the market, and then the output where minimum average cost is reached. Remember, we want to get where that minimum average cost is reached in order to gain what? Efficiency, right? So we're trying to get to that minimum point. So in case A, perfect competition, these are random numbers. So we need 1 million units are demanded by the market. The number of firms in the market are 10,000, and the output is pretty straightforward. It's a 1 million divided by 10,000. That gets us to 100 units in order to the output to reach that minimum average cost. Now moving from perfect competition to monopolistic competition, and then onward to oligopoly or oligopolistic competition. Remember, perfect competition, there are many suppliers out there. Monopolistic competition, lots and lots of suppliers, but there is some degree of market power, depending upon product differentiation. Remember that. The next one would be oligopoly, where there's just a handful. These are 3 terms, I believe. Oligopoly would be a few versus monopoly or duopoly. Monopoly would be 1, duopoly would be 2, but lots of different iterations. But we'll stick with perfect competition, monopolistic competition, which isn't represented here, but you get the idea. Oligopoly or oligopolistic competition, and monopoly or monopolistic competition. So for the oligopoly, again, we're looking at 1 million units that are demanded by the market. There are only 5 firms, a handful of firms, right? And their output where their minimum average cost is reached is 200,000, okay? So moving from oligopoly to monopoly, we have the units demanded by the market of 1 million again. The number of firms in the market is 1. In order to reach their minimum average cost, to be efficient, if you will, they would have to produce 1.2 million of those units. So the takeaway from this is as follows: is that even if there was just one producer, their minimum average cost that would be associated, or the units that would be associated with producing the minimum average cost, is more than the market actually demands, and more than the market needs. So again, this is the rationale for supporting why we have natural monopolies. All right. So even with one producer, the market cannot reach that minimum average cost point. So they can't be efficient even with one. So we have to have one. If we have less than one, we have 0. So we have one producer, and what we do is we control that producer in order to do what? Either focusing on efficiency. So we'll focus trying to get to that minimum average cost and keeping prices down for the consumer in that regard, but producing enough in order to be, still to focus on that efficiency in order to keep that business viable, that public utility viable going forward. So that's kind of the focus on the one end. The other focus would be on equity, which would be on focusing on the lowest cost, if you will, so far as the productive resources are concerned, keeping the cost down for the consumers in that regard. So at any rate, this is our little matrix, why it is that we allow monopolies, in this case a natural monopoly or public utility. Public utility meaning electric company, gas company, natural gas company type of an arrangement. Maybe even water companies, providing clean water for communities. Oftentimes they are done, through the governments, but nonetheless, it's similar to it's very much the same idea. Okay, so that's walking through our little matrix, moving from perfect competition over to monopoly. So one more time, starting from our matrix, we're looking on the far right. That KC would be for natural monopoly, again, where we allow that firm to charge more than that, more than they would otherwise, right? So we'll get to that in a moment. But case B, when we're talking about oligopolies, this is a space where we have various regulatory authorities: the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission, Department of Justice, Antitrust Division, EPA, others that are out there, but we'll focus on, again, the FTC, the Department of Justice, Antitrust Division, and this is where we focus on trying to maintain consumer sovereignty. So kind of the short version of this is that we have all these regulatory authorities set up in order to do what? We have these regulatory authorities set up in order to protect competition, not individual competitors. So again, just kind of keep that in mind as we kind of go forward, all right? Is that in the oligopoly space, moving anywhere aside from perfect competition, the closer you get to monopoly, the more regulations would be in place. So here's kind of the point, and it's do we want a monopoly to operate where marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost? Short answer is no, we don't want them to operate where marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost. So we want to focus on two different things. One is, do we want to focus on equity, or do we want to focus on efficiency? So equity is where average cost is equal to average revenue. Efficiency would be where marginal cost is equal to average revenue. All right, so these are the two different focuses when we're talking about two different ways of looking at it in terms of how we want to. When we're talking about regulation, monopoly, and there are a lot of other things, but we're really talking about what price is the consumer going to pay. And if we want to focus on equity, that means trying to lower prices as much as possible for the consumer. If we want to focus on efficiency, that is more in terms of trying to keep the company viable so that they can charge a high enough price in order to do that, in order to meet the demands of the customers and so on and so forth. So that's kind of the short story. Okay, so moving on, when we talk about oligopolies and cartels and market structures, again, moving from perfect competition to monopoly, a lot of different things come into mind. And when we refer to market structures, they often take some strange or different different formats. They come in different manners, different ways. So, for example, when we talk about like oligopolies, like within the oil industry, okay, that's an easy one for us. Energy. Typically, we think of companies: ExxonMobil, Shell, the list goes on, Marathon, etc. But that would just be for us. Those are our markets domestically. They operate abroad as well, but we'll just stick with the domestic market in the U.S. So when we can go beyond that as well. What I mean, we can go outside of the U.S. And when we're looking that way, we come across organizations like OPEC. OPEC is the oil-producing, exporting countries. I think that's what the acronym stands for. At any rate, it's OPEC. And OPEC, those are the folks that, like, the Saudi Arabias, Kuwait, Venezuela, Nigeria, that are massive oil producers, or crude oil producers that ship, export oil from their countries, right? Others would include such countries as, which will be very familiar, Russia, Canada, Mexico are huge exporters of oil, of energy in general, but we'll just stick with oil. When I say in general, I mean I would also throw natural gas and so forth in there as well. At any rate, so when we're talking about these oligopolies, and oligopolies they operate on the in terms of their interdependence with one another, and what that means is that they're very cognizant of prices that are being charged. So if you just have a handful of firms, they're very aware of what the other market competitors are charging. They're extremely aware of it. Anyways, we'll get to that in a minute. So the other piece I wanted to look at was, aside from this oligopoly, was also cartels. This is the reference to the OPEC. So a cartel is they're legal in terms of, so long as they're operating outside the U.S., because if they were operating in the U.S., they would not be legal. Cartels are, that goes back to the trust, to the monopolies, where you're banding together against the consumer, which is a reference actually to Adam Smith, where he said that whenever two or more business people get together, they are conspiring against the consumer. So remember, now this is 1776, and it's just as appropriate, if not so, more appropriate today. So cartels are illegal, meaning that you cannot fix prices. That's their role. That's what OPEC does. It fixes prices, and the way that it fixes prices is by doing what? Controlling supply, restricting supply if you want to raise prices. So that's what this is all about. This is that functionality. This is the function how an oligopoly also functions, by controlling the supply. They're able to manipulate prices. And oligopolies, of course, are they're not cartels, but if they're working, in concert, if you will, unofficially or or for their own benefit, if you will. This is where we start getting into such areas that we've heard the term collusion. This is where they're colluding. They're agreeing to prices. They're agreeing to price fixing without formally coming together and saying this is what we are going to charge. That's collusion. So again, the way that the cartel operates in oligopolies, again, similarly, this is where they're kind of acting independently, but they're acting interdependently, meaning that they're working for their own best interest, but they're also considering their fellow competitors in the same time. So Saudi Arabia, we've already been through this before, but Saudi Arabia wants to is the largest player in OPEC. So they are the market leader, if you will. So if their fellow members, OPEC members, don't want or they want higher prices, they want to increase their revenue. Remember, going back to price elasticity of demand, assuming that they're in the what? If they're in the inelastic range, and even if you're not in the inelastic range, what you could do is if you could shift supply inward, that would also effectively move you, if not into, then darn much closer to the inelastic range. Point being is that through restricted supplies, oligopolies and cartels, this is where they really manipulate prices, and this is why we say that they are price makers more so than they are price takers. It's not to say that they can dictate whatever price that they want, but they have much more power than do monopolistically competitive market participants or perfectly competitive market participants. They've got much more power, they being, again, the oligopolies. So with an oligopoly, we could either have a price leader, a dominant firm, or not. So that would be, again, a dominant firm example that we've talked about before would be General Motors within the context of the U.S. big three auto manufacturers. This is many, many years ago, but the idea is that at one point in time, going back to probably 50 to 60 years ago, General Motors had 60% market share. So they were huge. So far as Ford and Chrysler, they were larger than Ford and Chrysler combined at one point in time. So they had market power. They were the dominant firm. But it could be where there's no dominant firm. It all depends. They could be, again, in terms of oligopoly, they could have the same product, or they could be differentiated products, could be, so on and so forth. There could be a lot of different iterations, different ways of looking at it. Anyhow, so what we're talking about primarily is we'll focus on what's called the HHI, or the Herfindel-Hirschman index, and it's sum of squares, really straightforward, saying that in this case, we're looking at 4 market participants, 4 members, or 4 competitors within one market, okay, for example. And if we're looking at, the market shares that they have in the first one would be, they have a 30% market share. The second firm has a 30% market share. The third firm, 20%. And the fourth firm, a 20% market share. So this is the entire market up to 100%, right? So we take the squares, the sum of those squares. So we square the 30% to get 900. So we're ignoring the 0.30. We're just saying 30 times 30 gets us to 900, 900, 900, 400, and 400. Sum those up, we get to 2,600. That is a highly concentrated market, meaning it's very much an oligopoly, very strong oligopoly. Anything over 1,800 gets us into that oligopoly territory. So anyway, onward. So in the framework of that oligopoly, this is the land where we have lots and lots of regulation and antitrust. So oligopoly to monopoly, of course, as well. There's a significant amount of regulation, and a lot of antitrust legislation was passed going back, again in the 19th century. But in the 20th century, we'll stick with that for the moment. We're looking at the NLRB, the Natural Labor Relations Act, and that was in 1935, also called the Wagner Act. Davis-Bacon preceded that. That was prevailing wages. And prevailing wages, what that basically says is that in most cases we're saying whatever the union wage is. Union wages tend to be a bit higher. So whatever the wage is in a given jurisdiction, given area, if they're adhering to this Davis-Bacon Act, they have to pay all of the labor at the same rate. So if you're, say, you have one person is being paid $25 an hour, a union member, and another non-union member is working on the same project or in the same area, they have to also be paid that same wage, that $25 an hour. That's in essence the prevailing wage. Lots of antitrust exemptions, including most notably Major League sports. In particular, we're talking about Major League Baseball, and that was something that came up. And basically what happened was that it went to the Supreme Court, and so it was somehow arrived at, I believe it was Supreme Court, but it was at the federal level. They said that it was not it's not violating the antitrust laws because it's not interstate commerce, which that's unbelievable because it's most every game that is played, one of the participants is not from that same city, unless of course it's like the New York Giants, or excuse me, the New York Yankees playing against the New York Mets type of an arrangement. But anyway, you get the idea. These exemptions, whether we're talking about Major League Baseball, NFL football, NBA basketball, NHL hockey, there are these antitrust exemptions that they're afforded, and as a result of which we end up with these extremely high wages and extremely high payouts to owners, extremely high prices for teams, and into the billions of dollars to buy, a major league franchise like in Los Angeles or New York. Other along the lines of dealing with things that we're kind of talking about is the fixing farm prices, subsidies, milk boards, cherry boards in Michigan, milk boards in Michigan, Michigan Milk Producers Association, ag producers. These all came about, and they were before that time, of course, but they were really came on strong during the Great Depression. And the reason for that was that they were trying to raise prices. This is for another conversation, but this is also the Texas Railroad Commission is one that's extremely important because the Texas Railroad Commission, they were the main drivers behind the price of oil. Okay, so anyway, these are all different types of regulatory authorities, agencies, etc. So real quickly, one more time, when we talk about profit, the difference between profit and economics and accounting. Accounting, we'll start with that first. It's revenue minus expense is either profit or loss. That's straightforward. So it's the residual revenue minus expense, and whatever's left over, if there's anything left over, is your profit. If there's not, then that's your loss. In economics, you build your cost, and your cost includes what? It's not just it's not just the expenses that are associated with something. It also includes what? It includes your profit. So the profit is baked into that as well. A normal profit, an opportunity cost level profit, right? So one more time, when we talk about fixed cost and variable cost and so on and so forth, when we look at average fixed cost, the more that we're producing, the smaller that average fixed cost. We're spreading out the cost over more and more units. And on the right-hand side, we're looking at the buildup of that cost. And again, we're adding more units, so we're looking at the average total cost and the average variable cost. And that space in between the two is that average fixed cost as it becomes asymptotic, as it approaches zero. Increasingly what happens, and this is in the long run, all costs become variable. This is what represents, because what we're looking at is as we're increasing more and more production, that fixed cost becomes more and more absorbed into whatever the number of products that we're actually producing. And increasingly, that average variable cost becomes the primary cost that's associated with the production as we move further to the right. Okay, so one last bit so far as our when we're talking about markets, chapters 10 through 14, we're looking at perfect competition to monopoly. Just a real brief look at when we're talking about we wanted to go over some other regulatory type things that occurred, and that came through in the Smoot-Hawley, and this is going back, of course, into the Great Depression. Smoot-Hawley, when we're talking about putting the clamps on imports in terms of increasing tariffs. So this was all about tariffs. And after World War II, we had GATT, which took apart that Smoot-Hawley tariff. In essence, it was the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs. So we tried to reduce the amount of tariffs so that we could increase the trade. That was taken over in effect by the WTO, the World Trade Organization, in 1995. Same idea, focusing on reducing tariffs and bringing more parties in, to increase the amount of trade that would be out there. And on the other side of this, we have that's on the trade side. And the other side, we've got the Bretton Woods banking and exchange rates. This has to do with the finance end of it. Anyway, the other things when we talk about regulation, we're looking at, of course, the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission, the Department of Justice Antitrust Division, EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, OSHA, NTSB, which is the National Traffic and Safety Board, I believe it is. Just the takeaway from all of this is that the higher the regulation results in what higher cost. So as we moving away from perfect competition, closer to monopoly, there are a lot more costs that are flowing in the form of this regulation. In order to comply with these regulations, there's a huge amount of cost, and in essence, it's like a fixed cost. So whether we're talking about, it doesn't matter about the size of the company. If they have to adhere to those regulations, they have to have, they put the same amount of effort in, if you will. So anyway, it's just one last few words on regulation. In general, we're saying that the more regulation involved, the more cost that there is that's associated with that. So it adds to the cost, moving again closer to that monopoly, moving further away from perfect competition.